The candles flickered against the basement walls as 13 figures sat around a table carved from a single oak tree that had been struck by lightning. The clock above the stone fireplace showed 11:58 p.m. In 2 minutes, on the stroke of midnight, the Holloway family would begin their most sacred ritual, a supper that would forever change the quiet hills of Missouri and send shockwaves through communities across 3 states. What happened in that basement on October 31st, 1902, was so disturbing that local authorities sealed the records for nearly a century. The few surviving witnesses who dared to speak were dismissed as hysterical or mad, but the evidence was undeniable. Physical evidence that defied explanation. Evidence that challenged everything people thought they knew about the natural world. Tonight we're going to uncover the truth about the Holloway clan's midnight supper. A story so shocking that it was banned from local newspapers and scrubbed from official records. This is the story they didn't want you to know. The Holloway family arrived in the Missouri Ozarks in the spring of 1898, purchasing a sprawling estate 15 miles outside the small town of Crane Creek. To the locals, they seemed like ordinary wealthy folk from back east. Jeremiah Holloway, his wife Constance, their 5 children ranging in age from 8 to 22, and Jeremiah's elderly mother, known simply as Grandmother Holloway. But from the very beginning there were whispers. The Holloway estate sat on nearly 300 acres of dense forest, rolling hills, and a crystal-clear spring that the Cherokee had once considered sacred. Local real estate records show the property had changed hands 6 times in the previous decade, an unusual turnover rate that should have raised red flags. Each previous owner had left suddenly, often in the middle of the night, abandoning furniture, livestock, and in one case an entire season's crop ready for harvest. The townspeople of Crane Creek were a tight-knit community of farmers, loggers, and merchants who had carved out a simple but prosperous life in the Missouri wilderness. They were God-fearing people who attended Sunday services at the White Clapboard Methodist Church, held community barn raisings, and gathered for harvest festivals each fall. When strangers arrived, especially wealthy strangers with unclear sources of income, questions were bound to arise. Jeremiah Holloway claimed to be a retired businessman from Boston, though no one could recall exactly what business he had been in. He was a tall, gaunt man with prematurely grey hair and eyes the color of winter ice. His wife Constance rarely ventured into town, and when she did, she moved with an odd gliding gait that reminded people of how smoke drifts across still water. The children, Margaret, Thomas, Elizabeth, Samuel, and little Mary, were pale and unnaturally quiet, speaking only when spoken to, and always in voices barely above a whisper. But it was Grandmother Holloway who truly unsettled the locals. She appeared to be well into her 70s, possibly 80s, with silver hair that she wore in elaborate braids wound around her head like a crown. Her fingers were adorned with rings of unusual design, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change depending on how the light hit them. She carried herself with an authority that made even grown men step aside when she passed. The first sign that something was amiss came in late June, just 2 months after the family's arrival. Farmer Ezekiel Morton was checking his cattle in a pasture that bordered the Holloway property when he noticed something strange. A section of his barbed wire fence had been cut, not torn or knocked down by animals, but carefully cut with wire cutters. More disturbing was what lay beyond the fence line. Morton discovered a perfect circle, approximately 20 feet in diameter, where the grass had been completely burned away. The earth within the circle was charred black, but the fire had not spread even an inch beyond the circle's edge. In the center of the burned area, Morton found the remains of what appeared to be a large bonfire, but the ashes were unlike anything he had ever seen. Instead of the grey-white ash left by burning wood, these ashes were deep purple, almost black, and had an oily texture that left a strange residue on his fingers. When Morton approached Jeremiah Holloway about the incident, the man's response was both apologetic and evasive. Holloway claimed one of his children had been careless with a campfire and promised it wouldn't happen again. He even offered to pay for reseeding the damaged area. Morton accepted the apology, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Holloway was lying. The burns were too precise, too deliberate to be the result of a careless campfire. Over the following months, similar circles began appearing throughout the area. Always perfect circles, always with the same strange purple ash, always in locations that seemed to have some significance, near old oak trees, beside natural springs, or at the highest points of hills where ancient Cherokee burial mounds were rumored to rest. Local wildlife began behaving strangely as well. Deer that had grazed peacefully in the area for generations suddenly avoided the region entirely. Birds flew in erratic patterns, often crashing into trees as if they had lost their ability to navigate. Most disturbing of all, cattle and horses would sometimes be found standing motionless in their pastures, staring fixedly in the direction of the Holloway estate for hours at a time. Sarah Jenkins, the postmistress in Crane Creek, noticed that the Holloway family received an unusual amount of mail. Packages arrived weekly from cities across the country, New Orleans, Salem, Charleston, and other locations that Sarah couldn't identify from the postmarks. The packages varied in size from small envelopes to large wooden crates that required special handling. When Sarah asked Jeremiah about his correspondence, he simply smiled and said he was a collector of rare books and artifacts. The packages weren't the only unusual mail the Holloways received. Every few weeks a single letter would arrive with no return address, bearing only a wax seal in deep red. The seal appeared to depict some kind of symbol, though Sarah could never quite make out what it was. The image seemed to shift and change each time she looked at it, like an optical illusion that wouldn't hold still. As summer turned to autumn, the atmosphere in Crane Creek grew increasingly tense. Children began having nightmares about dark figures moving through the forest. Adults reported seeing strange lights emanating from the direction of the Holloway estate, lights that pulsed with an unnatural rhythm. Several residents claimed to hear music drifting on the night air, not the familiar melodies of hymns or folk songs, but something ancient and discordant that seemed to vibrate in their bones. Reverend Nathan Pierce, the Methodist minister who had served the Crane Creek community for over 15 years, became particularly concerned about the Holloway family's influence on his congregation. Several of his most devout parishioners had begun asking questions about the nature of good and evil, about whether there might be powers beyond human understanding that could be harnessed for earthly purposes. These were not the kinds of theological discussions that typically arose in his small rural church. When Reverend Pierce attempted to visit the Holloway estate to welcome the family to the community and invite them to services, he was politely but firmly turned away at the front gate. Grandmother Holloway herself emerged from the house to speak with him, and the encounter left the minister deeply shaken. He later confided to his closest friend that looking into the old woman's eyes had been like staring into an abyss that stared back. The first direct confrontation came in early October, when young Timothy Walsh disappeared. Timothy was 12 years old, the son of blacksmith Patrick Walsh and his wife Catherine. He was known throughout the community as a bright, curious boy who loved to explore the forests and hills around Crane Creek. On October 3rd, Timothy set out after school to collect hickory nuts for his mother's holiday baking. When he hadn't returned by sunset, his parents organized a search party. They found Timothy's schoolbooks scattered near the old Cherokee spring that bordered the Holloway property. His lunch pail was discovered hanging from a tree branch, as if it had been carefully placed there rather than dropped. Most disturbing of all, they found Timothy's shoes arranged in a perfect line pointing directly toward the Holloway estate, laces tied together in an elaborate knot that none of the searchers could identify. When the search party, led by Sheriff James Morrison, approached the Holloway house, they were met by Jeremiah and his eldest son Thomas. Both men appeared genuinely concerned about Timothy's disappearance and offered to help with the search. They claimed they hadn't seen the boy and suggested he might have gotten lost in the extensive cave system that ran beneath the hills in that area. The search continued for 3 days. Volunteers combed every inch of forest, explored known caves, and dragged the deeper pools of the spring. On the evening of the 3rd day, just as hope was beginning to fade, Timothy Walsh walked out of the forest and into his family's yard as if nothing had happened. But Timothy was not the same boy who had disappeared 3 days earlier. The child who returned was pale and distant, speaking only when directly questioned, and then only in monosyllables. His eyes, which had once sparkled with mischief and intelligence, now seemed flat and unfocused. Most disturbing of all, Timothy had no memory of where he had been or what had happened during his 3-day absence. Medical examination by the town's only doctor revealed no signs of injury or malnutrition, but the boy's parents were convinced something fundamental had changed in their son. Over the following weeks, Timothy's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would disappear for hours at a time, always returning with no explanation of where he had been. His grades in school plummeted, and his teacher reported that he seemed to be listening to something only he could hear. Most alarming of all, Timothy began drawing strange symbols in his schoolbooks, the same geometric patterns that adorned Grandmother Holloway's rings. Word of Timothy's condition spread quickly through the small community, and suspicion began to focus on the Holloway family. When Sheriff Morrison attempted to question the boy more thoroughly about his disappearance, Timothy suddenly began speaking in what sounded like a foreign language, not Spanish or French or German, which some of the townspeople might have recognized, but something far older and more guttural. Dr. Henry Blackwood, a physician and amateur linguist who had studied at Harvard before settling in Missouri, was called in to examine Timothy. Dr. Blackwood's report, which survived in his personal papers despite the later efforts to suppress all records of these events, described the boy's condition as unlike anything in medical literature. According to Blackwood, Timothy appeared to be in a form of trance state, aware of his surroundings, but responding to stimuli that others couldn't perceive. Most significantly, Dr. Blackwood recognized fragments of the strange language Timothy spoke. His notes indicate that some of the words bore similarity to ancient Sumerian and Akkadian texts he had encountered during his university studies, languages that had been dead for thousands of years, and certainly not something a 12-year-old farm boy in Missouri would have any knowledge of. The situation in Crane Creek was rapidly approaching a crisis point when the Holloway family made an announcement that would change everything. On October 25th, Jeremiah Holloway visited the town's general store and posted a notice on the community bulletin board. The notice, written in elegant script on expensive paper, invited selected members of the community to join the Holloway family for a harvest celebration on October 31st. The invitation was unlike anything the residents of Crane Creek had ever seen. The paper itself seemed to shimmer in the light, and the ink appeared to have been mixed with some kind of metallic powder that gave the words an almost hypnotic quality. But it was the content of the invitation that truly caught people's attention. The Holloways were offering to host what they called a midnight supper, a celebration of the harvest season that would begin at the stroke of midnight on November 1st. The invitation promised revelations that will expand the boundaries of human understanding and knowledge that has been hidden from the common world for centuries. Those who attended would witness the true nature of reality and gain access to powers that transcend the limitations of ordinary existence. The invitation concluded with a list of specific individuals who were cordially invited to partake in this most sacred feast. The list included Sheriff Morrison, Reverend Pierce, Dr. Blackwood, Postmistress Jenkins, and 9 other prominent members of the community, exactly 13 people in total. The reaction to the invitation was immediate and polarized. Some residents dismissed it as the eccentricity of wealthy outsiders trying to impress their new neighbors. Others saw it as confirmation of their growing suspicions about the Holloway family's true nature. A few, intrigued by the promise of hidden knowledge, privately admitted they were tempted to attend. Reverend Pierce was among those who viewed the invitation with deep suspicion. He had been studying his Bible and theological texts more intensively since the Holloway family's arrival, and something about their invitation reminded him of warnings about false prophets and those who would lead the faithful astray. He scheduled a special evening service for October 30th, urging his congregation to pray for guidance and protection against whatever evil might be lurking in their community. Sheriff Morrison took a more practical approach. As the elected representative of law and order in Crane Creek, he felt obligated to investigate any potential threat to public safety. After consulting with the county authorities in Springfield, Morrison decided to attend the midnight supper, accompanied by 2 deputy sheriffs from neighboring jurisdictions. If the Holloways were planning some kind of criminal activity, law enforcement would be there to stop it. Dr. Blackwood's decision to attend was motivated by scientific curiosity. His examination of Timothy Walsh had convinced him that the boy had been exposed to something beyond normal human experience, and he hoped the Holloway gathering might provide answers. As a man of science and reason, Blackwood believed that any phenomenon, no matter how unusual, could be understood and explained through careful observation and analysis. Sarah Jenkins, the postmistress, was torn between fear and fascination. Her access to the Holloway family's correspondence had given her glimpses of a wider network of individuals and organizations involved in what appeared to be serious scholarly research. The packages and letters suggested connections to universities, museums, and libraries across the country. Perhaps the Holloways were legitimate researchers studying folk traditions and ancient practices. Perhaps there was nothing sinister about their activities after all. As October 31st approached, tension in Crane Creek reached a breaking point. Those who had received invitations found themselves under pressure from friends and family to stay away from the Holloway estate. Anonymous notes appeared warning of dire consequences for anyone who attended the midnight supper. Someone painted a large cross on the front door of the Methodist church, along with the words, "Protect us from evil," in red letters. The weather on Halloween night was unusually warm for late October in Missouri. A thick fog rolled in from the valleys around sunset, reducing visibility to just a few yards and muffling all sound. The fog had an odd quality that veteran residents couldn't recall ever experiencing before. It seemed to glow faintly from within, as if illuminated by some invisible light source. At 11 p.m., 13 figures began making their way through the fog toward the Holloway estate. Sheriff Morrison and his 2 deputies arrived first, having decided to scout the property before the other guests arrived. They found the front gate standing open, with torches placed at regular intervals along the winding driveway leading to the house. The torches burned with an unusual blue-white flame that cast strange shadows among the trees. Reverend Pierce arrived next, carrying his Bible and a small wooden cross that had belonged to his grandmother. Despite his reservations about attending, the minister felt called to witness whatever the Holloways had planned. If evil was about to be unleashed in his community, he intended to stand as a barrier between darkness and his flock. Dr. Blackwood came prepared with a medical bag and a notebook for recording observations. Sarah Jenkins brought nothing but her curiosity and a growing sense that she was about to witness something that would change her understanding of the world forever. The other invited guests arrived in small groups, their faces grim with determination or bright with anticipation. Farmer Morton was there, along with general store owner Benjamin Hartley, schoolteacher Martha Prescott, and several other community leaders who felt they had an obligation to represent their neighbors' interests. As the clock tower in downtown Crane Creek began to chime 11:30, the guests found themselves gathered in the grand foyer of the Holloway mansion. The house was far more impressive inside than its modest exterior suggested. The walls were lined with bookcases, filled with leather-bound volumes in languages most of the visitors couldn't identify. Artifacts from around the world filled display cases, Egyptian canopic jars, Mayan obsidian knives, carved masks from Africa, and countless other objects that spoke of extensive travel and deep pockets. Jeremiah Holloway greeted each guest personally, his manner gracious but formal. He was dressed in what appeared to be formal evening wear, though the style was unlike anything fashionable in 1902 America. His jacket was deep burgundy velvet with silver clasps instead of buttons, and his collar was held closed by an ornate pin featuring the same shifting geometric design that adorned his mother's rings. Constance Holloway moved among the guests like a hostess at an elegant dinner party, offering refreshments and making polite conversation about the weather and local affairs. But there was something unsettling about her demeanor, a sense that she was performing a role rather than engaging in genuine social interaction. Her smile never quite reached her eyes, and she had a habit of tilting her head slightly when listening, as if she were hearing more than just the words being spoken. The Holloway children were present but silent, arranged like sentinels along the walls of the foyer. They watched the guests with expressions of barely contained excitement, as if they were anticipating some wonderful surprise that only they knew about. But it was Grandmother Holloway who commanded the room's attention. She sat in a high-backed chair that resembled a throne more than ordinary furniture, her silver hair braided into intricate patterns that seemed to catch and hold the lamplight. Her eyes moved constantly, studying each guest with an intensity that made several of them shift uncomfortably under her gaze. At 11:50, Jeremiah Holloway called for his guests' attention. In a voice that somehow reached every corner of the large room without being raised, he announced that it was time to proceed to the supper. The guests were invited to follow him through a door that led to a narrow stone staircase descending into the basement of the house. The basement was nothing like what the guests had expected. Instead of a typical cellar used for food storage or furnace equipment, they found themselves in a vast underground chamber that seemed to extend far beyond the footprint of the house above. The walls were carved from living rock and decorated with symbols that appeared to have been painted with phosphorescent paint, giving them a subtle glow in the dim light. In the center of the chamber stood a massive table carved from a single piece of oak. The wood was so dark it was almost black, polished to a mirror finish that reflected the faces of everyone in the room. 13 chairs surrounded the table, 12 for the guests and one larger chair that was obviously intended for Grandmother Holloway. The guests took their seats as directed, each finding a place card written in the same elegant script as the original invitation. The seating arrangement seemed deliberately planned to separate people who knew each other well, placing the guests among strangers and creating an atmosphere of formal dinner party etiquette. As the guests settled into their chairs, they began to notice details about the chamber that made them increasingly uncomfortable. The ceiling was supported by columns that appeared to be carved from single pieces of stone, each decorated with reliefs depicting scenes of figures engaged in activities that were difficult to interpret in the flickering candlelight. The floor was inlaid with an intricate pattern of different colored stones that formed geometric designs, radiating outward from the table like ripples on a pond. Most disturbing of all were the niches carved into the walls at regular intervals. Each niche contained what appeared to be a small altar, complete with candles, bowls, and objects that the guests couldn't quite make out in the shadows. The overall effect was of a temple or ceremonial space, rather than a dining room. At exactly midnight, as the distant church bells in Crane Creek began to toll the hour, Grandmother Holloway rose from her chair. The old woman moved with surprising grace for her apparent age, walking around the table to address each guest individually. As she passed behind each chair, she placed her hands briefly on the guests' shoulders, a gesture that might have seemed grandmotherly if not for the fact that several people later reported feeling a strange tingling sensation that seemed to penetrate through their clothing to their skin. When Grandmother Holloway returned to her chair, she began to speak in a voice that seemed far too strong for her frail appearance. She welcomed the guests to what she called the most important meal of their lives, and explained that they were about to partake in a tradition that stretched back thousands of years to the dawn of human civilization. According to Grandmother Holloway, the midnight supper was a ritual practiced by secret societies across the world, groups of individuals who had discovered that reality was far more complex and malleable than ordinary people believed. These societies had learned to tap into forces that existed beyond the physical world, forces that could grant knowledge, power, and abilities that transcended normal human limitations. The old woman's explanation was interrupted by the arrival of the first course. The Holloway children entered the chamber, carrying silver platters covered with elaborate dome-shaped lids. As the lids were removed, the guests found themselves looking at what appeared to be a perfectly normal appetizer course, delicate pastries filled with herbs and cheese, arranged artfully on fine china plates. But as the guests began to eat, they noticed that the food had an unusual quality. The flavors were more intense than anything they had ever experienced, seeming to resonate through their entire bodies rather than just their taste buds. Several guests reported later that eating the appetizers produced a sensation similar to drinking strong wine, though there was clearly no alcohol involved. Dr. Blackwood, trained to observe and analyze, began to feel increasingly alert and aware of his surroundings. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds more distinct, and he found himself noticing details about the chamber that he had missed before. The carved reliefs on the columns were not depicting the vague activities he had initially perceived, but specific ritualistic scenes involving robed figures engaged in what appeared to be ceremonial magic. Sheriff Morrison experienced a different reaction to the food. The lawman found himself becoming deeply relaxed, as if he were sinking into a warm bath after a long day's work. His usual vigilance and suspicion began to fade, replaced by a sense of trust and acceptance that was completely foreign to his normally cautious nature. Reverend Pierce felt neither relaxation nor heightened awareness. Instead, the minister experienced a growing sense of spiritual presence, as if he were in the immediate proximity of something divine or infernal. He couldn't tell which. The small wooden cross he carried seemed to grow warm in his pocket, and he found himself silently reciting psalms and prayers. As the evening progressed through multiple courses, each more elaborate than the last, the guests began to undergo subtle but significant changes in consciousness. Conversations that had started as polite dinner party chatter gradually evolved into discussions of profound philosophical and spiritual topics. People who had known each other for years discovered they were sharing thoughts and experiences they had never revealed to anyone. Sarah Jenkins found herself describing dreams she had been having since childhood, dreams of flying over vast landscapes and communicating with beings of pure light. Farmer Morton spoke about his deep connection to the land and his growing conviction that the earth itself was a living, conscious entity that could be communicated with by those who knew how to listen. The most dramatic transformation occurred in young Timothy Walsh's father, Patrick, who had not been officially invited, but had somehow found his way to the gathering. The blacksmith described experiencing visions of his son's 3-day disappearance, visions that revealed Timothy had not been harmed or traumatized, but had instead been taken on a journey through dimensions of reality that existed parallel to the physical world. As the supper continued past 1 a.m., then 2 a.m., the boundary between normal conversation and something far stranger began to blur. Guests reported feeling as though they were simultaneously sitting at the dinner table and existing in other times and places. Some described seeing the chamber as it had appeared decades or even centuries earlier, populated by different groups of people engaged in similar rituals. Dr. Blackwood later wrote in his suppressed report that around 2:30 a.m., the very nature of reality in the chamber seemed to shift. The stone walls became transparent, revealing vast networks of underground passages and chambers extending for miles beneath the Missouri hills. The ceiling opened up to reveal not the basement floor above, but a night sky filled with stars, arranged in patterns that defied astronomy. It was at this moment that Grandmother Holloway rose from her chair for the second time that evening. But the figure that stood before the guests was no longer the elderly woman they had met earlier. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Her posture was straighter, her skin smoother, her eyes brighter and more penetrating than before. In a voice that seemed to resonate from multiple directions at once, she began to explain the true purpose of the midnight supper. The guests had been chosen not randomly, but because each possessed qualities that made them suitable candidates for initiation into what she called the Ancient Order, a secret society dedicated to preserving and practicing knowledge that had been suppressed by conventional religion and science. According to Grandmother Holloway, human beings possessed innate abilities that had been systematically discouraged and forgotten over centuries of social conditioning. The capacity for telepathic communication, psychic healing, precognition, and even limited control over physical matter were natural human talents that could be developed through proper training and practice. The midnight supper was the first step in that training, a carefully orchestrated introduction to expanded consciousness that would prepare the participants for deeper levels of instruction. The food they had consumed contained substances derived from rare plants and minerals that could temporarily activate dormant areas of the brain, allowing people to experience reality as it truly existed, rather than the limited version perceived through normal senses. As Grandmother Holloway spoke, the guests began to understand that their perception of the evening's events was being fundamentally altered. What they had initially experienced as a somewhat eccentric dinner party was revealed to be an elaborate magical ritual designed to permanently expand their consciousness and recruit them into a worldwide network of practicing occultists. The revelation might have been terrifying, if not for the fact that the substances they had ingested left most of the guests feeling remarkably calm and accepting of these extraordinary claims. Even Reverend Pierce, who might have been expected to object strenuously to anything resembling witchcraft or devil worship, found himself listening with fascination rather than fear. But not everyone was equally affected by the Holloway family's preparations. Sheriff Morrison, perhaps due to his naturally suspicious nature or simply individual brain chemistry, retained enough skepticism to recognize that he and his fellow guests were being manipulated. As Grandmother Holloway continued her explanation of the Ancient Order's history and purposes, Morrison began to discreetly observe the chamber for possible escape routes. What the sheriff saw in those moments of clear perception would haunt him for the rest of his life. The carved reliefs on the stone columns were not static decorations, but appeared to be moving and changing, depicting different scenes as he watched. The niches in the walls contained not innocent altar decorations, but what appeared to be preserved specimens of creatures that defied biological classification, part animal, part plant, part something else entirely. Most terrifying of all, Morrison realized that the Holloway family members were not entirely human. In moments when the light struck them from certain angles, their faces revealed features that belonged to no earthly species, eyes that reflected light like those of nocturnal animals, skin that had a faint scaled texture, and teeth that were subtly pointed in ways that human teeth were not. Morrison's growing alarm was interrupted by a commotion at the far end of the chamber. Dr. Blackwood, who had been taking notes throughout the evening, suddenly threw down his pen and began speaking rapidly, in what sounded like the same ancient language Timothy Walsh had used weeks earlier. But unlike the boy's halting, confused pronunciation, Blackwood spoke with fluency and confidence, as if he were a native speaker of this impossible tongue. Grandmother Holloway smiled with obvious pleasure at this development. She responded to Blackwood in the same language, and the two engaged in what appeared to be a complex conversation about topics that the other guests couldn't begin to understand. However, several people later reported that although they couldn't comprehend the words being spoken, they somehow understood the meaning, as if the communication was occurring on a level deeper than ordinary language. The conversation between Grandmother Holloway and Dr. Blackwood revealed that the physician had been unconsciously studying the ancient order's practices for years, through his research into historical linguistics and comparative religion. His examination of Timothy Walsh had been the final catalyst needed to activate knowledge that had been planted in his mind through dreams and visions extending back to his childhood. As this extraordinary revelation unfolded, the other guests began to experience their own moments of awakening. Sarah Jenkins suddenly remembered a series of strange letters that had passed through her post office over the years, correspondence between members of secret societies scattered across the country, all using coded language to discuss meetings, rituals, and the gradual preparation of selected individuals for recruitment. Farmer Morton realized that the mysterious burned circles that had appeared on his property were not random acts of vandalism, but carefully placed markers designed to alter the spiritual energy of the land in preparation for tonight's ritual. Each circle had been positioned according to ancient principles of sacred geometry, creating a network of power points that channeled forces from deep within the earth. Reverend Pierce experienced perhaps the most profound transformation of all. The minister suddenly understood that his lifelong devotion to Christian teachings had been preparation for this moment, not because Christianity was false, but because true spiritual knowledge transcended the boundaries of any single religious tradition. The ancient order preserved wisdom that had been encoded in all of the world's great religions, waiting for individuals mature enough to perceive the deeper truths beneath surface doctrines. As dawn approached, the nature of the midnight supper reached its climax. Grandmother Holloway announced that the time had come for the final course, a communion that would permanently seal the guests' connection to the ancient order and grant them access to abilities they had never imagined possessing. The Holloway children appeared once more, this time carrying a single large chalice made from what appeared to be carved crystal. The cup was filled with a dark liquid that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating the optical illusion of a void in space sitting on the dinner table. Grandmother Holloway explained that the liquid in the chalice contained the concentrated essence of knowledge accumulated by the ancient order over thousands of years. Those who drank from it would gain immediate access to abilities that normally require decades of training to develop. They would be able to communicate telepathically with other order members, perceive events occurring at great distances, and exercise limited control over physical matter through focused concentration. However, she warned, the transformation was permanent and irreversible. Once someone drank from the chalice, they could never return to their previous limited perception of reality. They would see and understand things that ordinary people could not, which would forever separate them from normal human society. They would be members of a hidden elite, guardians of secrets that could not be shared with the uninitiated. The chalice was first offered to Dr. Blackwood, who accepted it without hesitation. The physician had already progressed too far in his transformation to have any doubts about proceeding. He drank deeply from the crystal cup, and immediately his eyes began to glow with a faint inner light. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond normal hearing. Blackwood described experiencing a sudden expansion of consciousness that allowed him to perceive the entire network of Ancient Order members scattered across the globe. He could see their activities, understand their purposes, and communicate with them directly through thought alone. The sensation was indescribable, like suddenly being able to see color after a lifetime of blindness, or hearing music after years of deafness. One by one, the other guests were offered the chalice. Most accepted without question, their resistance having been systematically undermined over the course of the evening, through a combination of psychoactive substances, psychological manipulation, and genuine spiritual awakening. Sarah Jenkins, Farmer Morton, and 8 others drank from the cup and joined the ranks of the initiated. But 3 guests refused the final communion. Reverend Pierce, despite his growing understanding of the Order's purposes, ultimately could not bring himself to participate in what he still perceived as a betrayal of his Christian faith. Sheriff Morrison's lawman instincts finally overcame the influence of the Holloway family's preparations, and he recognized that he was witnessing something that posed a fundamental threat to the social order he was sworn to protect. The third refusal came from an unexpected source, Patrick Walsh, Timothy's father. The blacksmith had been profoundly affected by the evening's revelations about his son's disappearance, but when offered the chalice, he realized that accepting would mean abandoning his responsibility to his family and community. Whatever benefits the Ancient Order offered, they came at a price he was not willing to pay. Grandmother Holloway accepted these refusals with gracious disappointment rather than anger. She explained that membership in the Ancient Order could never be forced or coerced. It required genuine spiritual readiness and willing acceptance of the responsibilities that came with expanded consciousness. Those who were not ready would be given additional time to prepare through dreams, visions, and gradual exposure to Order influences. However, she warned, those who had witnessed the midnight supper but declined to join could never speak of what they had experienced. The Order had methods of ensuring silence that went far beyond ordinary threats or intimidation. Anyone who attempted to expose the Order's activities would find themselves unable to articulate what they had seen, their memories becoming confused and contradictory whenever they tried to share their experiences with others. As the first light of dawn began to filter into the underground chamber through some invisible opening, the midnight supper drew to a close. The guests who had drunk from the chalice now appeared subtly transformed, their eyes brighter, their movements more graceful, their overall presence somehow more substantial than before. They spoke quietly among themselves, in a mixture of English and the ancient language they had somehow acquired, making plans for future meetings and discussing the responsibilities of their new status. The 3 who had refused the final communion found themselves escorted back to the mansion's main floor by Jeremiah Holloway, who treated them with the same courtesy he had shown at the beginning of the evening. He thanked them for their participation and suggested that they might find themselves more receptive to the Order's invitation at some future date. As Sheriff Morrison, Reverend Pierce, and Patrick Walsh made their way through the pre-dawn darkness toward their homes in Crane Creek, each struggled to process what they had experienced. The memories were vivid and detailed, yet seemed somehow dreamlike and unreal. By the time they reached the town, all 3 were beginning to doubt whether the evening's events had actually occurred as they remembered. Over the following days, the effects of Grandmother Holloway's warning became apparent. Whenever any of the 3 men attempted to describe the midnight supper to their friends, family, or professional colleagues, they found themselves unable to form coherent sentences. The words would come out confused and contradictory, making them sound as if they were describing a particularly vivid dream rather than actual events. Dr. Blackwood's official report, written immediately after the supper while his memories were still clear, provided the only detailed account of what had transpired. But when he tried to submit the report to county authorities, he discovered that he could not physically complete the action. Every time he approached the courthouse or attempted to hand the document to Sheriff Morrison, his hands would begin to shake uncontrollably, and a crushing headache would force him to abandon the effort. The transformation of those who had accepted the Ancient Order's communion became increasingly apparent in the weeks following the midnight supper. Dr. Blackwood's medical practice underwent a dramatic change as he began diagnosing conditions that other physicians missed entirely. Patients who had suffered from mysterious ailments for years found themselves completely cured after single visits. Word spread quickly through the region of the doctor's miraculous healing abilities, drawing people from hundreds of miles away seeking treatment. But Blackwood's new abilities extended far beyond conventional medicine. Patients reported that he seemed to know their symptoms before they spoke, that he could identify hereditary conditions by simply looking at them, and that his treatments involved mysterious preparations that bore no resemblance to standard pharmaceuticals. Several people claimed that Blackwood had warned them about future health problems that had not yet manifested, allowing them to take preventive measures that proved remarkably effective. Sarah Jenkins experienced equally dramatic changes in her role as postmistress. She began intercepting letters and packages that contained coded messages from Ancient Order members across the country. Without opening the correspondence, she could somehow sense which items contained important information and which were routine communications. This ability allowed her to serve as an unofficial coordinator for Order activities throughout Missouri and neighboring states. The network of Order members that Jenkins helped coordinate proved to be far more extensive than anyone in Crane Creek had imagined. Through her enhanced perception, she became aware of initiated individuals in positions of influence throughout government, business, academia, and religious institutions. These people communicated through seemingly innocent letters that contained multiple layers of meaning, coordinating activities that gradually shaped social and political developments across entire regions. Farmer Morton's connection to the land deepened into something that transcended normal agricultural knowledge. His crops began producing yields that defied explanation, thriving in weather conditions that destroyed his neighbors' harvests. He developed the ability to predict weather patterns weeks in advance, allowing him to make planting and harvesting decisions that consistently resulted in optimal outcomes. More remarkably, Morton discovered he could communicate directly with the consciousness of the earth itself. Through meditation techniques taught by Grandmother Holloway, he learned to perceive the planet as a living entity, with its own thoughts, emotions, and intentions. This communication revealed that the Ancient Order served as intermediaries between human civilization and the planetary consciousness, helping to maintain balance between technological progress and ecological preservation. The other initiated members of the Crane Creek group developed their own unique abilities based on their individual talents and interests. Schoolteacher Martha Prescott found she could instantly assess the true potential of any child and devise educational approaches that would maximize their development. General store owner Benjamin Hartley developed an uncanny ability to predict economic trends, always stocking exactly the right merchandise at exactly the right time. Each of these individuals also began experiencing regular visitations from other Order members who would arrive without warning to provide additional training or coordinate specific activities. These visitors included people from all walks of life: wealthy industrialists, university professors, government officials, and religious leaders who had been secretly initiated into the Order's mysteries over the years. Meanwhile, the three men who had witnessed but rejected the midnight supper continued to struggle with the aftermath of their experience. Reverend Pierce found his faith simultaneously strengthened and challenged by what he had witnessed. His sermons began incorporating themes that troubled some of his congregation: discussions of hidden spiritual realms, the inadequacy of conventional religious doctrines, and the possibility that divine truth existed beyond the boundaries of Christianity. The minister's personal prayer life became increasingly complex as he found himself drawn to meditation techniques that bore no resemblance to traditional Christian practices. During these sessions, he would sometimes receive visions of the Order's activities and purposes that left him torn between fascination and fear. He began to understand that the choice he had made at the midnight supper was not final. The Order was patient and would eventually provide him with another opportunity to join their ranks. Sheriff Morrison faced the most difficult situation of the three men. As a law enforcement officer, he was acutely aware that something potentially criminal was occurring in his jurisdiction, but he was powerless to investigate or prosecute due to his inability to articulate what he had witnessed. His attempts to research the Holloway family's background through official channels yielded no useful information. Their documentation appeared to be perfectly legitimate, though it had clearly been manufactured by individuals with access to highly sophisticated resources. The sheriff's growing frustration was compounded by reports from other residents of Crane Creek who had begun experiencing strange phenomena since the night of the midnight supper. Several people reported seeing figures moving through the forest at night, always at the edge of vision and always disappearing when observed directly. Children began having shared dreams about underground chambers filled with ancient artifacts and robed figures conducting mysterious ceremonies. Most disturbing of all were the changes in Timothy Walsh. The boy's transformation accelerated dramatically after the midnight supper, as if his exposure to the order's influences had been somehow amplified by the ritual his father had witnessed. Timothy began demonstrating abilities that no 12-year-old should possess, speaking fluently in languages he had never studied, solving mathematical problems that challenged adult scholars, and displaying knowledge of historical events that had occurred centuries before his birth. Patrick Walsh found himself in an impossible situation. His son was clearly being influenced by forces beyond normal human understanding, but every attempt to seek help was frustrated by his inability to explain what was happening. The boys' teachers reported that Timothy seemed to be educating them rather than learning from them, offering insights into subjects that went far beyond the standard curriculum for rural Missouri schools. The situation reached a crisis point in early December when Timothy announced to his parents that he would be leaving home to continue his education at a special school run by the Ancient Order. The boy explained, with a maturity that was terrifying in someone so young, that his current environment was limiting his development, and that he needed to be among others who could appreciate and nurture his expanding abilities. When Patrick refused to consider such a possibility, Timothy demonstrated powers that left no doubt about the reality of his transformation. Without touching anything, the boy caused books to fly off shelves, furniture to rearrange itself, and the temperature in the room to fluctuate wildly. He then calmly explained that these abilities were just the beginning of what he would learn to control as his training progressed. The confrontation was scheduled for December 21st, the winter solstice. The three men armed themselves with crosses, holy water, and blessed firearms. But when they arrived at the Holloway estate, they found it completely abandoned. The basement chamber was sealed behind a stone wall that appeared decades old. The family had vanished without a trace. Timothy Walsh disappeared along with the Holloways, leaving only a note explaining his choice to continue his education elsewhere. County records revealed the property had been sold to an anonymous buyer, with proceeds donated to historical preservation charities. The initiated members of Crane Creek continued their activities more subtly. Dr. Blackwood's practice attracted patients from across the Midwest, many connected to occult traditions. Sarah Jenkins facilitated order communications while maintaining detailed records of local social connections. The community experienced unprecedented prosperity during a period when other rural areas struggled economically. By 1905, the order had established a shadow network throughout southern Missouri. Initiated members held positions in law enforcement, government, and education, gradually shaping policy and social trends. Private schools that served as training centers for gifted children appeared throughout the region. Timothy's letters to his parents described advanced studies that combined traditional academics with unnamed disciplines. By 16, he was corresponding with university scholars and participating in expeditions to ancient ruins. His communications became increasingly formal and distant, as if writing to strangers rather than family. The psychological pressure of ongoing recruitment efforts took its toll on the three resistant men. Sheriff Morrison developed chronic insomnia and made increasingly erratic professional decisions. Reverend Pierce's sermons became unconventional, causing several families to leave his church. Patrick Walsh channeled his grief into intensive occult research, hoping to counteract the order's influence. Through his studies, Patrick discovered that the Ancient Order was one of several competing secret societies active throughout American history. These organizations shared goals related to human development and social transformation according to occult principles. The moral ambiguity of their methods made simple opposition impossible. Their activities appeared genuinely dedicated to human advancement. This complexity was illustrated by Crane Creek's continued prosperity and stability. Educational standards improved dramatically, crime rates dropped to zero, and the community attracted well-educated new residents. By 1906, Crane Creek had become a model of success that attracted government attention and study delegations. The Order used this success as a template for operations in other communities across the country. Their ultimate goal was creating a network where occult principles could be openly practiced, gradually transforming American society. Children exposed to Order influences from birth began displaying remarkable abilities, while adult residents developed enhanced capabilities simply through prolonged exposure to the community's transformed atmosphere. The implications were both inspiring and terrifying. If these techniques could transform small communities, they could presumably be scaled to affect entire populations. But such transformation would necessarily destroy existing institutions based on limited understandings of human potential. The tension between competing visions of society was embodied in the ongoing struggles of the three resistant men. Their inability to resolve this conflict made them valuable research subjects for studying barriers to occult acceptance. This research revealed that the primary obstacle was fear of increased personal responsibility, rather than intellectual or moral opposition. The Order's solution was gradual introduction of occult concepts through seemingly secular channels. Rather than presenting teachings as mystical, they framed them as advanced psychology and sociology. Community organizations dedicated to social improvement gradually introduced meditation and group consciousness exercises without revealing their occult origins. This covert approach proved successful in Crane Creek during 1908-1909, when previously resistant residents began participating in Order activities without realizing it. The measured improvements in health and creativity were attributed to modern scientific methods rather than ancient practices. Eventually, this approach convinced Patrick Walsh, Sheriff Morrison, and Reverend Pierce to reconsider their refusal. By 1910, all three had begun participating in community programs that gradually exposed them to occult concepts. Their transformation was slow and carefully managed to avoid dramatic conversion experiences. Patrick was first to achieve full integration, reuniting with Timothy, who had become a prominent scholar in the Order's educational system. Sheriff Morrison's initiation came through involvement in Order security operations. Reverend Pierce underwent the most complex transformation, requiring complete reconstruction of his theological framework. By 1912, every adult resident of Crane Creek was either a formal Order member or sufficiently influenced to support their activities. The community had become a perfect example of human society guided by occult principles. But success attracted opposition from competing secret societies and traditional power structures. The period from 1910-1920 saw increasing conflict between various esoteric organizations. These conflicts were fought through economic manipulation and political influence rather than violence, but their effects devastated communities caught in the crossfire. World War I created opportunities for various secret societies to advance their agendas, leading to conflicts over the proper role of occult knowledge in warfare and reconstruction. By 1920, Crane Creek had lost much of its prosperity and social cohesion as competing factions struggled for control. The decline represented a significant setback, but provided valuable lessons about maintaining occult influence in competitive environments. These lessons informed the Order's more subtle and resilient strategies throughout the remainder of the 20th century. The legacy of the Midnight Supper extended far beyond one Missouri community. The techniques developed in Crane Creek became fundamental elements of global operations, influencing political movements, religious developments, and cultural changes throughout the modern era. Today, nearly a century later, the ancient Order's influence continues shaping world events in ways most people never recognize. Members occupy positions of authority in every major institution, working toward their ultimate goal of human transformation and enlightenment. The Midnight Supper that shook the Ozarks was just the beginning of a story that continues unfolding worldwide as the Order pursues its vision of humanity awakened to true potential. The ban on this case was meant to protect a secret that remains as relevant and dangerous today as it was in 1902. The truth reveals not just what happened in one Missouri town, but what continues happening wherever individuals gather to explore hidden dimensions of consciousness and secret forces that shape our world. The candles were extinguished long ago, but the flame they lit continues burning in hearts and minds of those who tasted the forbidden knowledge offered at that fateful feast. Somewhere in seemingly ordinary communities, new midnight suppers continue, new initiates are recruited, and the ancient order's great work advances toward ultimate fulfillment. The story that began in Crane Creek in 1902 is far from over. In fact, it may be just beginning.